It would be really impossible to talk about Latin American culture or history or society without bringing the African apportation. We need to remember that over 15 million people were brought from Africa over 400 years. The first thing we need to bear in mind is the image of Africa, especially Africa in the 16th century, that we may have is probably wrong. The idea that we have about Africa has been mostly brought by the movies, by Hollywood, or even old movies with a colonialist mentality. And when we talk about Africa in the 16th century, we need to think about a continent that had organized states, empires, literacy, towns, standing armies, agriculture, etc., etc. We are not talking about a backwards continent. What happened is that in the 16th century, already since the 15th century, Africa was, especially the sub-Equator Africa, sub-equatorial Africa, as we call it, was withstanding a double attack, double invasion. In the Atlantic side, the Europeans, first the Portuguese and then everybody else. And from the east side, as well as down the Nile River and down the Sahara Desert, the Arabs and the North Africans. And then the 16th century was especially difficult moment when this colonial process started in Africa. And in that context is that we need to understand the collapse of many African cultures and the beginning of slavery in a scale that humanity never knew before. We are going to focus on the cultures of West Africa because for economical and from technical reasons, the slaves that were brought to the Americas were all coming from that part of Africa. Let's say between Senegal and Angola in the Atlantic coast of Africa. Bringing people from the other side of Africa across the Pacific Ocean would be impossible. It would take 8 months at that time, a time in which the navigation was so cumbersome and slow, etc. And then that means that up to some extent, the people coming to the Americas share some characteristics. Some ethnias, as the Yoruba, for example, provided millions and millions of the slaves. Yorubas ended up in the Caribbean area, ended in the United States, ended in South America, as far south as Uruguay, in the Pacific coast of the Americas too, in Peru, for example. And that's why when we analyze the Afro-Latin American culture, we find many traits that are common. Huge numbers of slaves were brought from the area around the Gulf of Guinea. Many more were brought, especially to Brazil, from Angola, because Angola was a Portuguese colony. And then we find this tendency among the Africans in Latin America to rebuild, to reconstruct the original cultures as far as they could, accordingly to their ethnicity, their background, the regions where they come from. The other element is that, a negative element, we can say, is that the colonialists, whether in the United States or in the Caribbean area or in South America, they try to not allow them to concentrate or to rebuild the culture. And then one of the means to do that was trying to split families, split ethnias, trying to not to have people speaking the same language, the same African language in the same plantation, and then they were forced to learn English or French or Spanish or Portuguese. That was a part of erasing the identity that was not only about culture, was also about, in many cases, erasing even their names. The Africans lost their names in the colonies in the US, but they lost their names also in South America, where they needed to use new names that were Portuguese or Spanish, of course. And that was not an innocent process. That was something that the colonialists designed, trying to erase as much as they could the original culture, the original identity, to incorporate them into a new environment and a new structure. Of course, most of us come from immigrant families, immigrants from everywhere, from Spain, from Norway, from England, from Scotland, from Germany, from India. But our families came at least with luggage, at least with something organized as free people with belongings. In the old times, people would try to bring as much as they could from their farm to start the new living in the new country. When we talk about the slaves, we talk about a completely different experience. We talk about people that were split from their families, split from their societies, brought almost naked, and with nothing else than their minds. No belongings, no material possessions at all, and at the same time not able to reproduce that because slaves were discouraged to reproduce their material culture, their African material culture in the new world. And then we need to think about that. People that just from their minds, from the knowledge stored in their minds, they needed to start in some way trying to invent or reinvent a new identity. And then when we compare the Latin American culture, the Afro-Latin American culture with the African culture, of course there are differences. Of course, more than a reproduction is a refraction of what we can see in Africa. But also it's amazing that with no material elements and no books and no writing and no nothing other than their minds, the Africans and Afro-Latin Americans were able to rebuild in a huge extent the African culture in the new continent.